Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are talking about plants for small spaces, specifically trees and shrubs for small spaces. And this is a super common need for customers at Bates Nursery. Just small spaces and being able to plant and enjoy them has become more and more of a thing year by year, especially as we're living on smaller properties with less land. We still want to get that enjoyment from our landscape without planting things that are just going to overwhelm us and cause issues. So small plants, small landscapes has really become a trend that we've noticed, and a lot of our plant breeders have definitely taken note. So today we're going to kind of explore options for small spaces, things you should consider for small spaces, and I'm sure y'all will have some questions because this is, like I said, definitely a very common topic. We deal with very dense spaces on a daily basis around here. So along with this demand for plants, like I said, the breeding has given us smaller plants. I still use, when considering the site and the plant, I will use the recommended full size on these plants, and we'll talk about this more as my spacing. So for instance, if we have a bed that's only 3 feet deep, I'm looking at plants that top out at about 3 feet wide, or else it's going to engage maybe a wall or a sidewalk. And then again, for spaces, if I want to do a screen of small plants, I'm going to use that width. Say this plant says 2 to 3 feet wide, well then my spacing will be 2 to 3 feet. We'll talk about that a little bit with boxwood. But just to get an idea of how to plan your space, definitely look at our tags, look at the website of these distributors, and that'll give you an idea of how much you can put in your space. As well as from walls. So I do tend to prefer putting a plant away from a wall, just so you get airflow. So spacing something definitely to consider when looking at your small landscape. And before you get started, and especially if you want to come out and talk to us, a couple things I would definitely do for your beds. One is just get some measurements. An accurate measurement, within inches would be really nice because we can really try to squeeze whatever we can into that bed. So accurate measurements, and then an idea of sun exposure. Now you can take a picture and we can get an idea of sun or shade, as well as the compass direction, whether it's a north-facing wall, south-facing wall, a combination of directions. Note that whenever we're looking for the plants, that's going to help us with success in that spot. So measurement and sun exposure, the two things we need when picking our plant for the small space. I would say a lot of times in these very small spaces, I would lean more towards there being a lot of shade, especially as we get close to a house. So as we get tighter spaces, definitely consider that sun exposure. So we're just going to jump right into looking at plants and options. Of course, there's probably plenty more out there I won't touch on. But we're going to start with evergreens, probably the biggest demand right now over the winter. So with evergreens, we're going to look at screening evergreens for small spaces, specifically for sun first. So the first plants I go to for more manicured tight look in the sun for a screen is Arborvitae and Juniper. Both of these do have narrow options and things that we can put into a tight space, and depending on how tall of a screen you need, most places we're looking at a 6 foot tall plant can give us a barrier between us and maybe another house or a road. So Arborvitae, I did pull one out here on the right, and this is one I'm not going to be able to put up on the table, but this is a Holmstrup Arborvitae, very similar to emerald green, which we sell a lot of. Emerald green can work in a small space. These are going to be a little bit shorter. So emerald green Arborvitae, 3 to 4 foot wide, 12 to 15 feet tall at maturity. This is a little smaller. These are going to say more like 5 to 7 feet tall, probably 3 to 4 foot wide. And I would say if they get really old, they can get a little bigger. But if the emerald green Arborvitae is just a little too big for you, this home strip doesn't get quite as tall. So this is an example of a different variety of the Arborvitae species that's just a little more compact. So an idea for screens. Now these, if I were doing a screen on my property line, I'd probably plant them about 3 foot apart, maybe 4 foot. Any further than that, I think you'll start getting gaps in your screen. So just something to consider with the spacing we mentioned. I don't think I have another Arborvitae out here, but there are other ones. We just want to stay away from big ones, like the green giant Arborvitae. Can get 20 to 30 feet tall, 10 to 15 feet wide. That's really going to outgrow a small space very quickly. Juniper, I didn't bring any juniper in with us today. There is one that's become real popular called Taylor Juniper, which is bred off of our native eastern red cedar. Taylor Juniper is a very narrow, 2 to 3 foot wide, and very tall, maybe up to 20, maybe above in height. This is basically an Italian cypress we can grow here in Middle Tennessee. So Taylor Juniper is an example of a very tall, vertical, you could get a 20-foot screen in a 3-foot wide space. Then again, they really prefer sun to be full, so it's going to take the right site. So Taylor Juniper, there's various other junipers. Of course, a lot of these evergreens you can trim to keep in that space, and that's something to consider. Holly is another evergreen that's really versatile. I do have one here. This is kind of a newer variety called Castle Wall or Castle Spire. One produces berries, one doesn't. And you should be able to just see the tips of this. This is basically a columnar holly. So as opposed to our Nellie Stevens, which can really be above the first story of a house, these Castle Wall and Castle Spires go maybe 7, 8 feet tall. About 4 foot wide, so that's a real perfect dimension. Very similar to our Arborvitae for a nice column. You could plant these 3, 4 foot apart, and you can get a nice screen with or without berries, depending on if that's a preference for you. A great option. There's some other hollies. Red Beauty is going to be more of a Christmas tree shape. Again, this is going to top out at about 7, 8 feet, so that's perfect for your small garden. Going to keep it above, below your roof line, below power lines. So holly, and here's another holly which is very popular, especially in pots, urban spaces, tight little gardens. This is a sky pencil holly, a Japanese holly. These are nice if you don't want any prickers on your leaves. These are a soft leaf holly. Probably one of the narrowest evergreens we carry. So these probably only get 1 to 2 feet wide. 8 to 10 feet is about the biggest I see here. So that's another good option if you have an extremely tight spot or to put in like the center of a pot. The sky pencil holly is super popular for that. And I don't know if I have another holly up here, but there are other holly options. There are some small shrub type holly. The good thing with the hollies versus the evergreen is these can really take sun or shade. So something to consider. And again, you know, some people are deterred by the prickers on the holly. The sky pencil doesn't have those. So you might be able to break away from the stigma of the aggressive holly if you want something for, say, like a small courtyard. People could brush up against this and it won't do any damage. One other one, the evergreens for sun, is Nandina, and I do have a Nandina. I can display this for y'all. Nandina is a really popular plant for good reason because they are evergreen or evercolor, you could call it. They do really well in full sun to part shade, and most of our varieties nowadays are 4 foot and under. So I believe this is a Gulf Stream, very similar to like say a Sienna Sunrise. But Gulf Stream is like 3.5 foot tall, about the same width. So really good for a small space, real soft foliage, constant color, easy maintenance, drought tolerant. There are other varieties such as Flirt Nandina, and those will be much lower. I mean, those only get about a foot or two off the ground. So something to consider. Again, tons of varieties coming out with Nandina. Most of them smaller and smaller and smaller, so you can fit it into your bed. The great thing about Nandina is the texture. It's got a very bamboo, soft, fern-like texture, which really mixes well with other plants. So that's Nandina, another good evergreen. You could even put this in shade, but it does really well in dry sun as well. Okay, so I think that's most of the screening evergreens. I'll talk about a couple of more hedge, bushy type plants. In the Arborvitae family, just like this home shrub, there's a couple of, actually probably more than a couple of these dwarf Arborvitae. I have a Hetz midget here, and then a fire chief Arborvitae. Is that too much on the table?
No.
Okay. And a fire chief Arborvitae, just to give you an idea of the variety of color you can get. Again, these do better in a sunny spot, but if you're looking for a little focal point, or you want to do a little hedge, or you just want them to stand on their own, say on a corner, these Arborvitae are really nice for small beds. The Hetz midget and the fire chief are like 3 to 4 foot. There's a few other ones out there as far as these rounded Arborvitae, but they would pair well with the other Arborvitae. So if you have some verticals in your small space, and maybe in another bed you have some of these rounded ones, you're going to have the same color and texture. So these are really great if you just want to use, you like that color, that texture, maybe mix some of these shrubs with the vertical ones in your small space. The fire chief is very unique in that it's going to put on this kind of bronzy, rusty red color on the outside. And then on the inside, it's going to have the light green. So the foliage is going to come out green and then kind of get a bronzing color. So let me actually, if you look at that next to the Nandina, you get a lot of color coordination between these. So, you know, if you're going for more of this bronzy, warm color tone, this would be a great option for your bed. If you like kind of more of the formal, nice dark green, Hetz midget, and there's a bunch of other Arborvitae, would be great options for your sun gardens. Okay. So next I want to talk about focal point evergreens, more specimens, more unique plants. In these small beds, if you can have something that really has an effect, draws your eye, it can fill up that space without having to pack it full of plants. So focal point specimen, meaning something you typically plant one of and kind of tends to be in the center of your bed or around a corner, somewhere where you focus on it. And there's quite a few of these for a small bed. So this is a Serbian spruce, and I know these are only supposed to get probably 3 foot tall, slower growing, and this is a product from Isolae. Isolae is a nursery that specializes in growing and breeding evergreens, and much of what they offer is extremely dwarf or slow growing and miniature. Something like this put maybe in a rock garden or up on a little bit of a hill and underplanted by perennials can really let you focus on this kind of small, unique plant. So kind of like putting a bonsai in a garden, you can kind of walk around it and just kind of enjoy that one specimen plant. The trade-off is they tend to grow slow. So if this is something that you need immediate size, this may not be your option, but if you want kind of a delicate small bed, something that you can talk about, these little specimen evergreens would be a great option. And there's a whole slew of them. This one's called Pomoko, which is a very specific variety. Pretty hardy Norway spruce. We have a couple more. Right here is a Hinoki Cypress that is on a standard, what we call a standard, and you could probably see that from the shot. Hinoki are great shrubs. A lot of them do tend to be on the smaller end, but with a standard like this, it's really not going to overpower your bed. And what we mean by standard is this plant is grafted onto a single stem. So we do have a trunk and then that shrub on top. And these tend to stay small most of the time. And you can really put that in the center of your bed, and then you have room to underplant it. So anything on a standard is a great option for a small garden. It'll bring it up to eye level. And then again, the trade-off is going to be a little bit slower growing. They tend to be a little bit higher priced because of all the work that goes into making them. So any standard is a great option. There's junipers, we get hydrangeas in standards. Really good as a focal point. Excuse me. A couple others I don't have in here as far as evergreens for specimens. There's like tea olive, osmanthus is a smaller specimen plant. Gardenia, I recommend Gardenia near a structure, near a wall to protect it from winter winds, but Gardenia is a glossy leaf evergreen with fragrant flowers. They tend not to get much bigger than 4 feet, so Gardenia might also be an option that we don't have up here. Evergreens for shade is where I want to go now. So evergreens for shade, we're way more limited on this as far as our options. So let's see what we have. What I don't have up here is Akuba. Some of you might be familiar with it. Akuba is a glossy leaf evergreen. I hesitated to grab some because they can get up to 6 feet tall and wide, but slowly. So Akuba is good for a deep shade location. I have Pieris, and I could probably pull this one up on display. Probably a little bit out of the shot, but this is Pieris. Pieris japonica, it's not a great plant to use in multiples and massings in a garden because they just don't grow really fast or really large. But as a specimen in a small garden, this can do really well. Now these can take full sun. I actually prefer them in part shade. But this is a glossy leaf evergreen. It puts on these racemes of blooms in the spring. Again, this would go well in a small garden. The biggest one I've probably seen in Middle Tennessee is about 5 foot tall, and that's a very old specimen. So not the greatest choice for a fast-growing screening plant, but as like a specimen or a focal point, that's really where Pieris should be used. Like I said, they're delicate, and they can be really enjoyable to kind of walk around. So that's Pieris japonica. Whoop. And it's ready to go in the ground. Holly, again, the hollies would also do well in the shade. Plum U.
Hey, Ben.
Yes, sir.
We got a question from PJ. Is there an osmanthus that is for Zone 7?
You know, osmanthus is right on the edge of our hardiness. Now, I have one that is in full sun in the middle of a garden bed. And I believe most of them are not going to be recommended for Zone 7. However, mine does just fine. If we get a late frost, it might die back a little bit, but then it tends to rejuvenate. So with osmanthus, if you plant it just like gardenia up against a structure or a wall, you should have very little issues with dieback over the winter. But yeah, we are right on the edge of their cold hardiness. The goshiki is probably a little more sensitive in a high exposure area, but just the fragrant tea olive seems to be a little tougher. But if it's in a spot where it doesn't grow a lot, if you're only getting 4 inches a year and then it dies back due to frost a foot every year, then that may not be a good choice. But yeah, osmanthus, we're right on the edge of their hardiness zone. But if you're putting them close to your house or close to a garage or a structure, they should do just fine. But yeah, great question. You know, it's definitely Zone 7. I don't think they're typically recommended for, but I've had a lot of success with mine and not had any issues with it. So that's one of those more marginal plants, but one of the best smelling blooms in my garden. So it's kind of worth the trade for me. And then in a small garden, typically it's going to be protected. So if it's protected, I'd go for tea olive osmanthus. I think it's a great option.
We have another question
Sure.
from Stephanie. I have a couple Arborvitae, Anna's Magic Ball. Mine turned yellow and brown. Is that normal? Will they turn green again once the season changes?
Yeah, Anna's Magic Ball is, if I'm not mistaken, a little more of a yellow tip variety. Yellow is totally normal on the Magic Ball. Brown would probably make me be concerned. If it's brown on the very center, the inside, and it's shedding, this is totally normal. Arborvitae tend to do that. But if you're getting brown from the tips, that's something to be concerned about. Again, the yellow's not a concern. If it's bronzing, let me see if I can find... If it's bronzing, like on this Arborvitae, you know, if the brown is more of a bronze, then that should be fine. As long as they're not dead in the brown, it should be fine. And a lot of those plants in the spring will get a rejuvenated color to the leaves. Like this Arborvitae, when it starts warming up, that bronze will literally turn to this green on the inside. And sun exposure, the more sun these get, the more they tend to discolor. So with your Anna's Magic Ball, if you are getting dead brown tips, you should be concerned. Yellow is normal. Brown on the very middle is totally normal. But wait and see what happens in April, May. That's really going to tell you how that plant is doing. Arborvitae tend to grow in the spring. So maybe give it a little light fertilizer at the end of April, early May, and see what happens. I know Anna's Magic Ball is one of the more extreme dwarfs, so I think they can be very slow to get going. My advice to you, if you're not sure, is check the mulch level underneath that Anna's Magic Ball. These Arborvitae do not like to stay wet, so if there's mulch on the trunk, if it was planted too deep, it could make it rot, and that could be causing brown tips. So check the moisture level, check the planting depth, make sure mulch is not up on the trunk, and then by spring you should get it.
She said thanks. They're actually in the pot still. So.
Okay, yeah, and that's just another thing, and I know we've touched on this at the nursery, but in the pot, if it stays in the pot, it's going to be a little more difficult to keep happy. If you put it in the ground, you don't have to worry about water and cold spikes as much. So the best thing you can do is get those plants in the ground. I wouldn't hesitate to do it right now. So if you can, plant them. That will solve a lot of potential issues.
All right.
Okay.
We have another question too from Lois. Why does my pencil holly die out in the middle? How do I replant the shoots off of the roots too? Additionally, mine have always died after replanting.
Yeah, I mean, it's sky pencil holly is a little bit slower of a grower. It doesn't like transplanting. It's a little slower to root than some other hollies. So I wouldn't transplant it within a year of it being planted. You're really going to do a lot of damage in just pulling it up and moving it. And because they grow so slow, they don't rejuvenate quickly. And this is a pretty common problem with them. If you have brown in the middle of your sky pencil holly, what I would do is cut that branch out all the way down to the bottom if you can. And they should sucker from the base and form new branches. Again, they are slow to do that, so the more sun it has, the better it's going to stay green, and also the better it's going to stay tight and have more vigor. So what I would recommend for yours is cut that brown out of the middle, and then maybe give it some Hollytone this spring. Hollytone's a great product to try to get hollies happy, the right acidity level, and this can really help them put new growth on, as well as making sure they're drained well. If it's heavy and wet, they're going to have a slow time recovering. So trim the brown out and get as much sun to it as you can, maybe a little Hollytone in the spring, and limit your transplanting. I would say these will probably go through transplant shock for 3 to 6 months easily. So if you transplanted it, don't expect a lot of new growth for probably 3 to 6 months. It is typical.
We have a couple more questions. Are any of the Arborvitae bagworm resistant?
Yeah, bagworms are tough. I don't think any of them have specifically been bred for bagworm resistance. Bagworms are a little bit different than other pests and diseases as far as how we can breed a plant to resist it, because bagworms really don't attack a specific species. They'll attack anything that they can bag on. I've seen them bag pine needles. I've seen them bag on a chain link fence, on maple trees, everything. But they do like the nice soft foliage of Arborvitae. So I don't know of any variety that's specifically bagworm resistant. I usually tell people to go for a chunkier evergreen as an alternative if you have bagworms. The real underlying thing is, if you know you have bagworms on your property, you really need to take care of those bagworms, because they will attack almost any plant, really. Holly would be a little bit more resistant to bagworms. Now, if you have an infestation, they can definitely jump to holly and bag on holly. But yeah, with Arborvitae, I don't know that they've bred bagworm resistance. It's kind of a very common problem, but I would say just make sure you don't have bagworms on your property. If you don't, I wouldn't worry about them too much, and I wouldn't be too concerned about them unless you start seeing them on your tree. Or if you do have them on your property, maybe consider an alternative, something with a broadleaf. They don't want to bag on as much. Even this Plum yew has a very thick needle. They don't really like to bag on that either. So yeah, complicated with bagworms, definitely. Oh, sorry, I'm flipping. Yeah, so bagworms, just make sure they're not on your property. If you do have them, you can use a number of products to get rid of them, but maybe avoid Arborvitae if you know you have a bagworm problem. They'll definitely attack them.
Cool. Okay. The questions are still coming in. I do want you to get to the yew that you have there. Let's see. Mary says, I realize Christmas holly is not a small shrub, but are they acceptable as a screen plant in Tennessee? I read fast growing and easy maintenance.
Yeah. I mean, Christmas, Christmas holly, Christmas jewel. I would consider that a large screen holly.
Will they take part shade?
Oh yeah. Hollies are great for full sun to part shade. That specific type of holly is bred to have, really they have heavier berry productions, and they tend to be a little bit of a pyramidal shape, and I think that's where they get their name, Christmas holly. But yeah, they do great. Just maybe don't put it in a really small space. I would say they're going to get at least 6 to 8 feet wide and probably double that in height. So, you know, expect over a 15-foot tall tree and at least half of that in width. But they should do fine here. Yeah, pretty versatile plants. Similar to a Nellie R. Stevens holly as far as size and dimension.
All right, and our last question, and then I'll let us get back to it for a little while, and then we'll take more questions later. Susan says, what advice do you have about laurels for screening with leaves shriveling, eventually turning brown, somewhat crispy, then the entire branch dies? Is this peach tree borer? If so, what do I do?
With a borer, I couldn't diagnose a borer unless you're seeing holes in the trunk. So if you look at the trunk of your laurel and you have holes, now this is different than a woodpecker hole. They're going to be smaller, and when they're active, you'll actually see they'll leave behind a little kind of toothpick sticking out of the trunk. That's the only way I could diagnose borer. It's not extremely common in laurel, but they can attack anything prunus, which is laurel. The most common thing I see wrong with laurels is shot hole fungus, and I'm not sure if this is what you're talking about, but the holes in the leaf shot hole fungus is specific to laurels, and they almost all have some degree of it. And this is very similar to the shriveling of the leaf. So the way I take care of shot hole fungus and browning shriveling leaves is the same. It's all connected to excessive moisture and water. So if you're getting whole branches dying of the tree and shriveling brown leaves, I would tend to start looking at the trunk of the plant and the soil to see if if the mulch is piled up around that trunk. That could just be rotting the plant where it is, and it's just basically causing it to die. Or look at irrigation. So if you have irrigation on laurels hitting the leaves, this is a pretty direct cause for that. So laurels don't like water on their leaves. They don't like to be pruned excessively, and they need some airflow. So with your laurels, check for holes, make sure you don't have holes on the trunk, then we can look into borers and doing insecticide. Otherwise, I would look at mulch level on the trunk, make sure they're not planted too deep, make sure where the trunk hits the ground is free and clear. Don't prune them or shear them excessively. So I try to prune laurels only once or twice a year with hand pruners if I can. When they get sheared, they tend to get dense, hold moisture, and that's where that rot comes into play, causing the leaves to turn brown and get holes. So with the laurels, again, check the trunk, keep water away from the leaves if you can, and let them dry out a little bit. You just don't want them in a humid, moist spot. You're welcome to send us a picture of them. Sometimes laurels, if they haven't been taken care of real well, they can kind of peter out as they get big. At a certain point, you might just consider replacing the plant. But take a look at those things. Root rot and shot hole fungus are the two most common issues that I think will be related to what you're talking about.
All right, let's continue.
Okay, yeah, we'll jump in and we'll definitely answer y'all's questions as they come in. So, so we were talking about small space evergreens for shade. And I was saying that there's not a lot of options for heavy shade. The Cephalotaxis, the Japanese plum yew family, is a great option. Now these grow a little slower, but this is fastigiata, so you know, 1 to 2 feet wide. I've seen them 6 feet tall on average, so great for a small space. You can plant multiple of them for a screen. Again, the drawback is probably 4 to 6 inches a year, but pretty slow. But these can take quite a bit of shade, nice texture, similar to the sky pencil holly in use, but a little slower growing with that needle. We do have something called a plum yew, which goes low and wide. So if you have a height limit, but not a width limit, there's a plum yew that's similar to this, but horizontal. So the Cephalotaxis Japanese yews, great option for small shade spaces. We talked about holly, Akuba, and then a big one, and this could go for sun as well, is boxwood. And I have a few boxwood options here for y'all. The great thing about boxwood is they are pretty reliable. You know, they have a few issues that can crop up in them, but to be honest, for the most part, if you plant them right and take care of them right, boxwood really does have limited pest and disease issues. I get asked about boxwood blight a lot, but that's something that really is not a problem in our area of Tennessee, and all of our distributors have to inoculate their boxwoods. So it's a great option. I wouldn't be too worried about pest and disease because they're very a cornerstone plant for sun or part shade, and for small spaces. So I've got a few options. There's a ton of other boxwood that stay very small. Monrovia has a few that they distribute. This is Petite Pillar. There's also another one called Wee Willie that's similar to that, but a little more rounded. A couple feet, 2 to 3 feet tall, so great for a low hedge, knee-height hedge, or to stand on their own. And the other two I have are Saunders Brothers boxwood, which Saunders Brothers is a great resource, and they're a great breeder. of boxwood varieties, and they come up with new ones all the time. They have a series of probably the most miniature, I would call them, boxwoods. So we're talking 1 to 2 feet tall, 1 to 2, maybe 3 foot wide on some of these. So if you just really want a very low hedge or low miniature garden, boxwood is a great way to add just color and canvas to that bed.
You know, Ben, I met a customer about a couple months ago, said she was wanting to make a miniature hedged little area for her small dog to play in. And I recommended those boxwoods heartily because that's exactly what you can get out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing with dogs is sometimes they tend to urinate on boxwoods. So, you know, definitely be ready to accept a little bit of yellowing on them. But yeah, there's something called a knot garden, and I've had the pleasure of helping to build one. Knot gardens, you literally plant these real tight and you can form little bitty ribbons on the ground. So really neat and different ways to use it. This is Insolaris Nana. Again, this is a Saunders Brother boxwood. It's got a little bit of bronzing on it. I think these are, what do I say, 1 foot tall, 3 foot wide, so you could get a nice hedge out of this. And this is Little Missy. I believe it's 1 to 2 foot tall and wide. Yeah, 2 to 3 foot, so very small. Most of our boxwood varieties are about 4 to 8 foot range. These are all under knee height, so really neat. You can use these in a variety of spaces. Kind of like we were talking earlier with the laurels and other plants, the one thing with boxwood is they prefer good drainage. So heavy wet sites would be the only drawback for these, but great to add to your small, even a miniature garden. These would look really cool in. So boxwood, lots of options for you. There's other ones. Grace Hendrick Phillips is another Saunders Brother introduction. There's a whole slew of boxwoods for small spaces. So we've kind of gone through most of the evergreens that I'm looking at for small space. Again, there's probably some other options out there. I was going to switch to more flowers for small spaces because that's something we get asked a lot spring through summer. So flowers, probably the one that comes to most people's mind, and it doesn't look all that impressive right now, is a hydrangea.
Wow.
But you know, in the winter, you can cut them back and they can look fine. You know, it's not ugly, it's not ratty. But this is Bobo. So this is a Panicle Hydrangea similar to Limelight. But Bobo, they've bred to basically do the same bloom, the big panicle, lime green to white. Very hardy, but we're talking 4 foot and below. So Bobo is like a 2 to 4 foot hydrangea. It kind of breaks the rules for hydrangeas. Usually we're looking at a 4 foot and up shrub. These stay a lot smaller, and as you can see, you can really cut them back. So Bobo, and there's other varieties, but Bobo is a dwarf, almost a miniature Panicle Hydrangea. There's other ones out there, Little Lime, Little Quickfire. There's even some dwarf Macrophylla colored hydrangeas. I know the, not the Seaside Serenade, but there's, I think it's the Martha's Vineyard variety. Those are all very small. We're talking like 2 to 3 foot. So hydrangea, flower power in the summer, can't beat it. This is going to be more of a sun one. Some of the other varieties of hydrangeas are going to be shade. There's even dwarf Annabelle varieties for deep shade. So hydrangea, we can find a nice small variety. They're not all going to get 8 feet tall like the Limelight. Roses, and in fact I kind of have a rose that would be typical for a garden this time of year. So this was a new one last year. This is a petite knockout. If you're familiar with knockout roses, super popular. I've seen knockout roses get up to 8 feet if you don't touch them, so a big bush. These petites, I believe, are supposed to stay under a couple feet. Yeah, 18 inches tall, so like 1 to 2 feet. So you're going to get the same, and I brought this miniature rose from our garden center. This is about what the blooms are going to look like spring through fall. So a great option. Roses are really easy to take care of. You can cut them back in the winter. But as far as flowers go, especially in a sunny spot, can't beat a rose. Like I said, there's all these miniature roses. This Petite Knockout, reblooming, miniature, disease resistant. A great option that we started carrying last year. Again, the blooms are going to look a lot like this cute little miniature rose. We just got these in at the garden center. You could absolutely plant this outside. Again, there's other miniature roses out there that we'll get in the spring. Another good option for a small space to bring some color. Butterfly bush. And surprisingly, and in my garden, butterfly bush is still holding leaves, and this is about what mine looks like. Traditionally, butterfly bushes got head height, they're bigger. The trend has been lately to breed them smaller and smaller and smaller. This one's called Miss Pearl. It's a dwarf white. I believe 4 foot, 4 to 5 foot. We also carry another variety called Pugster. And we get those in white, blue, purple, pink, all sorts of colors. The Pugsters are supposed to stay under 3 feet. And for a sunny spot, butterfly bushes are just very prolific, very fragrant. They do pull in pollinators, so butterflies and all sorts of other critters will just swarm to these, as well as these miniature or dwarf varieties aren't as aggressive, and we've had concern about some of these older varieties becoming invasive. With these extremely small varieties, that's not really a concern. So if you want a butterfly bush for a small space, these are really great. You don't have to worry about them getting out of control or spreading. And you can see this has been cut back, so you can keep it tidy in the winter. So that's Buddleia, butterfly bush, probably one of the most enjoyable flowers in the summer.
It's amazing how many different like little skippers and butterflies are on it.
Oh yeah, they will just load up. Now, technically it is not native, so it's not a habitat for plants, and they're not laying eggs on it, but it will give them a source of pollen. So, you know, if you want butterflies to basically grow and lay chrysalis in your garden, maybe have a butterfly bush to attract them, and then have another habitat plant,
like a milkweed,
such as sweet shrub, calycanthus, or Lindera benzoin, spice bush. Plant that in your garden too, so that they're drawn in, they have food, and then they also have a place to lay their eggs. So definitely don't be afraid of butterfly bush. It'll bring in some immense pollinators. I mean, everything, up to Japanese beetles even. Forsythia, that's another one. And this has been a new thing. Linwood Gold is an old-fashioned Forsythia. My mother grew that Forsythia, and they got up to 12, 15 feet tall, probably 20 to 30 feet wide, which is just a massive shrub. Luckily, we've been able to get smaller and smaller Forsythia. This is Starlet, Show Off.
Ben, would you mind holding up the tag towards this camera here?
Yeah, like that.
Yes, there we go.
And you can even see, looking at this plant, how many buds. Each of these little clusters of buds is going to be a cluster of flowers on this. I believe these are going to be in the 3-foot range, which is extremely small for a Forsythia. One of the first things to bloom in the spring, daffodils and forsythia. It's like the sign spring is coming. Most of us don't have 10-foot tall, 30-foot wide to plant these things in. So there's a few other varieties of forsythia in all different size ranges. So if you love forsythia, but you're just like, I don't have room, we've got one for you. And then it's going to do the same number of blooms just condensed onto this little plant. So really excited for these in the spring. I think these are going to be a hot seller. And there's a whole nother, there's a whole breeding program of this series of forsythia, and there's a few other ones out there. Great option. Full sun to part shade, but flower power and forsythia, can't beat it.
Now, I believe we do have a webinar coming up that kind of covers some new varieties that are landing for the year.
Yep, and I'm not sure. We'll probably try to talk on these. This variety, the first time I saw it was last year, 2020. But we'll try to touch on some of these.
Yeah, March 10th.
Yeah, March 10th. So we'll talk about new varieties.
An introduction to new plant varieties.
Yeah, and here at Bates, that's one of the things we specialize in, is carrying all these new varieties, having a vast selection of options. And the good thing is most of those new varieties are smaller and smaller and more condensed for our more urban gardens. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I have not even gotten the full list of all the new plants, so we're going to kind of be discovering together for that. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, a question here. Curious about spirea. Apologies if I joined late. Not sure if it was covered, but I have some spirea that are more sparse and not sure if old or unhealthy or normal for them to be less full in season. Yeah,
absolutely. Spirea, I actually have it right on the end of my list to mention.
There we go.
Yeah, good little shrub for a small space. Spirea does tend to look pretty ratty right now, and in fact, I'm going to touch on barberry. It's going to look a lot like barberry right now, literally a bunch of stems. But spirea, if you really want to rejuvenate it next year, pretty much fall through winter, I wouldn't hesitate to maybe give it a little cut back. Spirea can put new buds on pretty quickly. So you could probably cut your spirea almost to the ground. I don't think that would be a problem, or maybe giving it a haircut, or maybe even taking out a few. If you have very mature old stems in that spirea, you could take out some of those large stems and get it to rejuvenate. Yeah, if yours looks kind of ratty like this barberry, very typical this time of year. What we tend to do on the lot, we'll cut them in half in the fall, just literally chop them down, and then they'll bush out a lot better next year. Sometimes they can get littered with dead leaves in the center. That would be something every year I'd go in and take a leaf blower or rake and get all those old leaves out of the center of the plant. If those old leaves stay, they might cause issues with it being full and bushing out every year. So yeah, absolutely spirea. I'd say go ahead and give it a haircut. Pretty reliable plant. You really can't damage it. Even if you cut it off at the dirt, it should be just fine. So yeah, give your spirea a little cut, maybe a little food, late April. Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
I think we're pretty much, that was most of the flower power for small spaces. Again, there's probably more. I did kind of want to mention azalea. There are some azaleas that work for small spaces. Our Encore Azaleas, you know, there's some that are in the 2 to 3 foot range. They'll bloom spring, summer, and fall. So Encore Azaleas, great option for small spaces. There's also a Gumpo Azalea, also known as a Satsuki. Gumpo Azaleas are almost like the texture of a boxwood. So Gumpos are very tight, low to the ground, and they bloom very heavily in the spring. So Encore Azaleas, Gumpo Azaleas are good for small spaces. Most of these were for sun, flower power for shade. I did mention hydrangea varieties. Gardenia we mentioned earlier would do well in the shade. Pieris, you know, these put these racemes of blooms on in the spring. Pieris would do well in the shade and bring some flowers to your small garden. I'm trying to think of any more. Camellia, but camellia do tend to get a little bit bigger. Like I said, there are some azaleas. Gumpo Azalea will do fine in the shade and stay small. I do want to make sure we talk about edibles, because that's something, I mean, people are always passionate about, especially in Middle Tennessee where we can grow so much. Edibles for a small space. Blueberries, probably one of my favorite edible fruit production plants. There's a whole series of blueberries called Bushel and Berry. And this whole Bushel and Berry series, see if I can get to where you see it, is really geared towards urban gardening, small spaces, fully self-fertile. You can grow these in pots, in beds. And you can see just the number of buds on this plant. And this one specifically is blueberry glaze. But again, these are grown to be dense. They're going to put more fruit on a smaller plant. So even if you're out on, you know, a patio in a condo, you can still produce blueberries successfully. So blueberries, great option for a small space. You can cut your big blueberries down every year. There's a whole slew of these. There's a jelly bean, blueberry glaze. I'm trying to think of the other series, but any bushel and berry blueberry, great for a small space. Berry crops in general, I think, can be done in a small space. Excuse me. I was mentioning earlier, Goji Berry. I've got a Goji Berry. We don't carry a ton of it, but Goji Berry can be contained into a small space. Raspberry, blackberry, you can prune them down, but the bigger they get, the more you're going to get off of them. We do carry some very small fruit trees. In fact, over here, I've got a Patio Peach. Here, we'll put it down behind here. So this is a Patio Peach. Patio Peach has a little more of a stone in the fruit, so a little more of a seed versus the flesh content from some other large fruit trees. But they will produce peaches, and they are edible. They may not have as much, you know, liquid content to them, but Patio Peaches, they're really bred for the leaves and the blooms. You'll get those pretty pink peach blooms, as well as one variety has a red leaf or a green leaf, and then you get those really pretty, nice colored peaches dangling off it. You know, these, I've seen them probably get 4 or 5 feet tall, 6 feet across, but for a fruit tree, that is extremely small. So Patio Peach, you know, you could grow this in a pot. You could grow this right outside of your front door. So blueberries, Patio Peaches, you know, if you want to eat your landscape, there are some options for you, even if you have a very small amount of space.
We're approaching the end kind of our webinar session. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat below. We'll do our best to address them right when Ben finishes everything up.
Yeah, and I'm kind of on to my last little section, which is basically everything else on here. So we talked about fruit, deciduous plants for small spaces. So first thing that comes to mind is Japanese maples. There are a ton of Japanese maples out there. Generally, we consider them dwarf versions of a full-size maple tree. So most Japanese maples are going to stay well under 25 feet. Some Japanese maples only get 4 to 6 feet tall. So great option for a focal point, a specimen in your small garden. Stick a Japanese maple in the center of your bed, and it can really just make the area. So I've got one here called Shaina, or Shaina. And this is more of a dwarf Japanese maple. You can see that it has a very dense branching pattern. It doesn't grow a lot between what we call the nodes, so it's going to be a much denser plant. I think Shaina is going to be like a 6 to 8 footer. Yeah, 6 to 8 footer, so very small tree, good to put in like the center of a bed, underplant it. Just a good medium small size Japanese maples. I would call this a dwarf Japanese maple, and there's a bunch of terms that get used. So this is dwarf, more columnar, so it'll grow upright. We do get some varieties that are pygmy, and in fact I've got one here to show y'all. I don't know if it'll be too big. Can you see that? Wow. Here, I'll pull it down. So this is Sharp's pygmy, and this is one that's on a standard, like we talked about the Hinoki. This generally tells me it's not going to get huge, this standard, but Sharp's pygmy is like a 4 foot tall estimated Japanese maple, so very small. If you just really want to scale down your beds, something like a Sharp's pygmy, there's other ones like this, Shishigashira, are all 6 foot and under. So a great option to stick in the middle of a small scaled down bed. The trade-off with these is they're going to grow slowly, like 3-4 inches a year. Then again, that cuts down on maintenance. So that was Sharp's Pygmy. There's a whole slew of what I'd call pygmy Japanese maples, which tells me it's like under head height. There are columnar like Shaina. There's one called Twombly's Red Sentinel that grows vertical but narrow, so you can get some that can fit into a tight space. As well as weeping Japanese maples. Weeping Japanese maples tend to stick around 6 to 8 feet tall and wide, so they can do well in a small space, but with the weeping Japanese maples, do consider that they tend to get a pretty good width on them.
I got a quick question here
Sure.
from Deborah. Can barberry be cut back like spirea?
It can be. Barberry tends to be slow, much slower than spirea, so I do, in fact, we're going to talk about barberry next anyways. I do resist the urge to cut these back a lot because, you know, 4-6 inches on barberry is probably average. You know, a foot would be a very fast-growing barberry. Just remember, when you're cutting all that back, you have to wait for it to grow back. So you can totally prune barberry, shape it over the winter, but it's slower than spirea. So just consider that when we're doing hard cuts. Barberry should survive any hard cut. I probably wouldn't cut them down to the dirt, but feel free to give them a haircut, a shaping. Just know it's going to take them a little while to recover. So when you're pruning, you just need to weigh up those options, the way it looks versus how long it's going to take for it to grow. Which is also a good thing in a small space. If it grows slow, that's less work for you to trim them. So yeah, barberry, since we were asking about barberry, great option for a small space. I mean, these are probably some of the smallest deciduous shrubs, and they grow medium slow, you know, 4 or 6 inches a year is probably average. Here I have more of a low bush type, and this is more of a vertical type. That's Orange Rocket, and I think this is Sensation, which is going to be a yellow pygmy barberry, which is a word that gets used for these. So if you see a pygmy crimson barberry, it's probably one of the smaller varieties, but for the most part, barberry, 3 foot tall, would be a pretty large one for these small varieties. The Orange Rockets, you know, 3 foot tall and a foot wide would be pretty common. The benefit or drawback to these is they do have thorns on the branches in the winter. So it is a good deterrent versus the boxwood, which are probably dog friendly. A dog would probably not want to go through this. So if you want a barrier up by the mailbox to keep critters from, you know, using that as a bathroom, barberry is a good option. The drawback to barberry is shade. I wouldn't recommend these for deep shade. Full sun, drought, great plant for a small garden. In pots, they do well too.
I got a question from Susan. Thoughts on growing a Meyer lemon tree in a pot in the sun in our zone?
I would say late spring through summer into early fall, not a problem. When our temperatures are getting below 50 degrees or so on average, that lemon needs to come ideally in your house. A garage it might survive in, but it's a little too cold for them to stay outside for us in the winter. So like I said, late fall through early spring, those lemon trees need to come inside. A lemon tree could live in your house year-round if it has enough sunlight. But like for instance, I have a sweet bay, so like the herb bay. I grow one of those in my garden, and then every year I'll dig it up in the fall, put it in a big pot, and bring it in my house. Of course, it gets pretty big every year, but I do have a large bay, and it will grow much more profusely outside in the natural sunlight. So yeah, putting your lemon outside through our summer, great option to get some growth, maybe encourage more fruit production, but bring it inside in the winter, especially in a pot.
Yep, and I mean, I have got mine in my garage right now, under
Still
a grow
has
light.
leaves?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I actually just fertilized it because the grow light's on like 14 hours.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, light would be the big drawback for citrus. For me, I know they have a highlight requirement, so you know, using a grow light if it's in a garage is going to help a lot. But yeah, my uncomfortable zone is like 50 degrees and less for citrus. I get a little worried about cold hardiness. So, you know, if we're getting temperatures below that, bring it inside.
You know, speaking of uncomfortable zones, there's a question here about an espalier triangle Christmas camellia from the holidays that a customer has received. Any tips for maintenance? I believe she planted it in front of a long brick wall for warmth.
Yeah, that's a great option. Camellia, and the good thing is they've been breeding camellia to tolerate further north, so they've gotten hardier for us. Near a wall is ideal, a wall, a garage, a house, just to cut out that winter wind. They can take a good amount of sun, but here in our hot summers, giving them a break in the afternoon is nice. And a wall usually provides that cast shadow that'll protect it. The trellis that those came on, I would probably leave it on that wooden trellis for maybe a year. They usually have vinyl tape, which will snap when that camellia gets too big, but I would keep it on the trellis for a year. If it outgrows that, take it off that trellis and put it on something new. Maybe give it some holly tone in the spring to kind of give it a little boost. And then just make sure it doesn't go bone dry, and I think that's a good location you have it.
Cool. Also, additionally, will a patio peach in a pot survive winters here?
Yeah, it should. They're pretty cold hardy. If it's in a pot that is really, really small for the plant, so it's really restricted, doesn't have a lot of extra soil, you might consider it pulling it on a screened-in porch, a patio, a garage, just to protect it. With the peaches, it's more of that late frost in the spring that's really going to do some damage to the fruit and the blooms. So I don't see a problem with keeping it in a pot, but just watch out in the spring if we're starting to get a late frost in April. Maybe bring it somewhere protected, just give you a fighting chance.
All right, and a question from Lisa on Facebook. Evergreen pencil shrub, holly, about 6 feet tall, is starting to separate. How do I keep that from happening?
Yeah, that is a very common problem in them for these plants, just because they are so tight and tall. Once they start separating, it can kind of be a working uphill battle. That's why I don't recommend them in deep shade. They can tolerate it, but the more shade you give them, the less vigor they're going to have, and they tend to kind of soften and lay over if they're not in full sun. That and too much excessive water can cause them to do that as well. If it's splitting in the middle and it's starting to divide, you might consider just throwing some twine or something around it to kind of hold it in together, and then give it some good fertilizer this spring to try to get that thing to form firm growth on those stems. I wouldn't keep it tied up for more than a year or two, because eventually the plant's just going to fall out when you take it off. So any more sunlight you can get to it, make sure it's not sitting excessively wet. And then you could tie it in. Now, if you're getting branches to just fall off the side, like it's just kind of falling over on the edges, I would just cut off those. If you're just getting 1 or 2 branches, I would just cut those off at the base just to kind of tighten it up. You can also give them a haircut to kind of help them throw on some new growth, but that's definitely a common problem with them. Anytime we get a plant that narrow, there's always kind of a give and take, and with the sky pencil holly, it's that tightness. that can sometimes fall apart when they get too shady. So check all those things. Like I said, worst case scenario, you can tie it together for a couple years, give it some fertilizer, and then untie it and see if that kind of helps.
Okay, that seems to be all the questions we've got.
Okay, and I think I've pretty much gotten through. We talked about barberry. We touched on spirea. We had a question on spirea. Good plant for a small space. Weigela, similar to spirea. I don't have one here, but spring blooming, low growing shrub. Those are all good options. And then I just wanted to retouch on varieties of plants. The best thing is nowadays, the dwarf plants, small spaces have become increasingly in demand. And so a lot of our distributors have really started breeding varieties specifically for that. So, you know, say someone in your family had a Forsythia, you love them, you just know you don't have room. Well, maybe there is a new variety that we can work into your space. So definitely help us explore new varieties of plants you're familiar with, because there might be a new one on the market that'll fit your space. So just something to kind of keep your eyes and ears out on what's available. And you mentioned the talk in March.
Yep, March 10th.
March 10th, new introductions. That'll be a good one to tune in for that.
Yep. And I'm going to go ahead and just post the link here to our website, where you can look at our other boot camp webinars that we have, sign up, register. We try to keep them uniform. Sometimes we may reschedule, like push a little bit here and there because our availability changes at the nursery. But we do have quite a bit coming up in February and even into March. And that's as we go into our busy season here at the nursery. So we also have another project in the works. Ben's helping with the establishing of a garden here at the nursery where we can demonstrate plant varieties and kind of, you know, best practices for ensuring your own garden success. So, you know, stand by for that. And we very much appreciate you for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you.